Don't go to the top floor, unless you want to lose this job. The warning still echoed in Emily Carter's mind as she stood alone in the marble hallway, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against floors that probably cost more than her entire life savings. She tightened her grip on the cleaning caddy, her fingers still raw from scrubbing for 12 straight hours, and glanced at the elevator panel glowing quietly at the end of the corridor, the button marked PH, pulsing like it was calling her name, like it knew she only had 3 days left before her. Landlord changed the locks, and everything she owned fit into a single duffel bag. Emily exhaled slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she remembered the final notice taped to her door that morning, bright red letters screaming, "Past due." And something inside her shifted. Not recklessness, not exactly, just a quiet, desperate kind of courage, the kind that whispered, "What's the worst that could happen? You're already at the edge." Her hand moved before she could stop it, pressing the button, and the elevator door slid open with a soft chime that felt too gentle for the decision she was making. Inside, the ride up felt longer than it should have, each floor number lighting up like a countdown she couldn't reverse, her heart beating faster with every passing second until the doors finally opened to a silence that felt different, heavier, like the air itself was watching. The penthouse stretched out in front of her, dimly lit, all glass and shadows, the city skyline glowing. Beyond the windows like a world she didn't belong to, Emily stepped inside, her footsteps cautious, almost apologetic, setting her supplies down as she scanned the room for signs of life. But there was nothing, no voices, no movement, just the faint hum of something electrical and the distant sound of traffic 50 floors below. She swallowed, telling herself to just clean quickly and leave. No one had to know. But as she moved deeper into the space, something shifted, a presence she couldn't explain, like the room had been empty a second ago, and now it wasn't. And then she saw him. A man sat in the far corner, half hidden in shadow, still as if he had been there the entire time, watching without a word. Emily froze, her breath hitching, her mind scrambling for an apology that wouldn't sound like a lie. But before she could speak, his voice cut through the silence, low, calm, almost detached. "You weren't supposed to come up here." Her heart dropped, heat rushing to her face as she stepped back instinctively. I'm sorry, I thought." But the words died in her throat because he wasn't angry, not exactly, just observing, his eyes steady, unreadable, like he was measuring something she couldn't see. He leaned forward slightly, the light catching just enough of his face to reveal a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken for reasons she didn't understand. "Then clean," he said simply, leaning back into the shadows again. "And don't touch anything that isn't yours." The words should have felt like a warning, but something about the way he said them felt like a test, and Emily didn't know why. But she suddenly felt like everything she did next mattered more than just a paycheck. Emily nodded quickly, her voice barely steady, and turned away before he could read the panic written all over her face, forcing herself to focus on the simple rhythm she knew so well. Wipe, rinse, repeat, as if cleaning could anchor her in a place that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too exposed. She moved carefully through the penthouse, hyper-aware of every sound she made, every object she touched, as though the air itself might report her mistakes. And yet the silence behind her never broke. The man did not move, did not speak again, but she could feel it, that quiet attention following her like a shadow she could not shake. Minutes passed, maybe longer, time stretching thin as she worked, until she reached the edge of a sleek glass table near the center of the room and froze for a second, her eyes catching on something that did not belong to her world, a thick envelope, unsealed, resting casually beside a set of keys, the corner slightly lifted as if it had been placed there in a hurry or perhaps on purpose. She hesitated, her hand hovering just inches away, not to take it. But because it was impossible not to notice, the crisp edge of $100 bills visible inside, more money than she had seen in months, maybe longer, her stomach tightening as the thought slipped in uninvited. 1 bill could cover groceries, 2 could buy her time, 10 could keep her from sleeping in her car next week. Her fingers curled slowly into her palm, pulling back as if the envelope might burn her, and she exhaled quietly, forcing her attention back to the surface of the table. wiping around it carefully without disturbing a single thing. Behind her, there was the faintest shift, not a step, not a sound she could clearly name, but enough to remind her that she was not alone, that this moment was not invisible, and for a brief second, she wondered if that had been the point all along. She continued cleaning, moving from one room to the next, each space more immaculate than the last, yet filled with an emptiness that felt deliberate, like a place designed to impress rather than to live in, until she reached a smaller room tucked behind a hallway, softer somehow, less perfect, where a single picture frame sat crooked on a shelf, its glass cracked down one side. Emily paused again, something about it pulling her in, not because it was expensive, but because it looked forgotten, and without thinking she set her supplies down, gently straightening the frame and adjusting it so it stood properly, her thumb brushing lightly over the crack as if that small gesture could fix more than just its position. She stepped back, studying it for a moment, then turned to leave when his voice came again, closer this time. "Why did you do that?" he asked, not accusing, just curious, and she swallowed, caught off guard. "It looked like it mattered," she said quietly, not daring to turn around. And there was a pause, longer than before, the kind that made her heartbeat louder in her ears, until finally he spoke again, softer now. "Most people would have thrown it away." And Emily shook her head slightly, a small, almost invisible movement. "Some things are not meant to be replaced," she replied, her voice steady despite everything, and this time, the silence that followed felt different, less like observation, and more like something had just shifted in a way neither of them fully understood. The silence stretched between them, but it no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like something unseen had shifted its weight and was watching more closely now, and Emily forced herself to keep moving, picking up her supplies again as if nothing had happened, though her heartbeat had not quite settled. She moved back into the main living area, her eyes briefly flicking toward the glass table where the envelope still sat exactly as before, untouched, unchanged, almost too perfect, and this time she did not even slow down, as if acknowledging it again might mean failing some rule she could not name. Behind her, she sensed him move for the first time, not fully, just a subtle change in presence, like he had leaned forward or shifted his stance, and it made her straighten instinctively, focusing harder on her work, determined to leave no trace of hesitation. Minutes passed, and then his voice came again, closer than before. "You have been doing this long?" he asked, not as a statement, but as if he genuinely wanted to know, and Emily glanced over her shoulder for just a second before returning to the surface she was wiping. "Since I was 17, she answered, her tone calm, though there was a quiet weight behind. It pays the bills," she added after a beat, softer this time. And there was a pause, as if he was considering that answer more deeply than most people would. "And that is enough for you?" he asked, and she almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so far from simple. "It has to be," she said, then hesitated, her hand slowing just slightly. "For now," she added, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was something about the way he stood there, listening without interrupting, that made it easier to speak than it should have been, easier than it had been in a long time. And for a moment, she forgot that she was not supposed to be here, that he was not supposed to be anything more than a silent presence. "I was saving to start my own cleaning business," she continued, surprising even herself. "Nothing big, just a few clients, something steady, something that is mine." And she let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "But life does not always wait for your plans," she finished, her voice quiet again. Behind her, there was another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed just slightly, less distant, more thoughtful. "And if you had the chance," he asked, "would you still choose that?" And Emily nodded without turning, her answer immediate. "Yes," she said, because that part at least had never changed. "I do not need much, just something honest," she added, her fingers tightening briefly around the cloth in her hand. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt heavier, not uncomfortable, but full, like something important had just been placed between them without either of them fully acknowledging it. And then, almost as if on cue, there was a soft sound behind her, a faint rustle, followed by the unmistakable slide of paper against glass. Emily turned slightly this time, just enough to see from the corner of her eye as he stepped away from the table, leaving the envelope exactly where it had been, but now slightly closer to the edge, more visible, more tempting, as if the test had not ended, only deepened, and for the first time, she understood that this was not just a job anymore. It was something else entirely, something she had walked into without realizing, and she did not know why, but she had this sudden, unshakable feeling that whatever she did next would change more than just the next 3 days of her life. Emily did not move right away, her eyes fixed on the faint shift of the envelope now sitting just a little too close to the edge, like it had been placed there for her to notice again, for her to think about it longer than she should, and she felt that quiet pull return, not temptation exactly, but pressure, the kind that builds slowly, asking the same question in different ways. She turned back to her work instead, pressing the cloth firmly against the surface in front of her, focusing on the small, controllable details, the streak of dust disappearing under her hand, the soft scent of cleaner filling the air, anything to keep her mind from wandering back to what she knew was still there. Behind her, the silence held, but it felt sharper now, more deliberate, like every second she did not react was part of something she could not see. After a moment, she set the cloth down and moved toward the kitchen area, her steps steady, her posture calm, as if she had already made her decision. And there was nothing left to consider. She filled a glass with water, the sound of it pouring loud in the stillness, and for a brief second she wondered if he would say something. If this was the moment he would push further, but he did not, and that somehow made it harder, because it meant the choice was entirely hers. She turned, walking back past the table without slowing, without looking, placing the glass down on the counter behind her as she picked up her supplies again, continuing her work like the envelope did not exist. Time passed in that quiet rhythm until she reached the final section of the living room, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she was aware that this moment was closing, that whatever this was would not last much longer. She finished wiping the last surface and stood there for a second, taking in the room, the perfect stillness of it, the untouched envelope, the man still watching from the shadows, and something in her settled, a quiet certainty she had not felt when she first stepped off that elevator. She walked back toward the entry, gathering her things, her footsteps echoing softly against the marble, and just before she reached the door, his voice came again, stopping her in place. "You saw it," he said, not a question, and Emily turned this time, meeting his gaze for the first time fully, her expression calm but firm. "Yes," she answered, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise. He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching, as if he was looking for something deeper than her words. "And you did not take it," he continued, and she shook her head slightly. "It is not mine," she said simply, her voice steady, and for a second, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something unspoken. Then he stepped forward just enough for the light to catch more of his face, revealing a faint shift in his expression, something close to approval, though he did not say it outright. "Most people would have found a reason," he said quietly. And Emily held his gaze, not defensive, not proud, just honest. "I do not need a reason to keep what is not mine," she replied. And this time, the silence that followed was different again, not heavy, not tense, but almost resolved, like something important had just been decided without either of them needing to say it out loud. And as she turned to leave, she could not explain why, but she had the distinct feeling that this was only the beginning of something she had not intended to start. Emily stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, but the silence of the penthouse seemed to follow her all the way to the elevator, lingering in her thoughts as the numbers slowly counted down, each floor bringing her closer to the reality waiting outside. The overdue rent, the empty fridge, the uncertainty that had not disappeared just because she had done the right thing. When the doors opened, the building felt different again, louder, more ordinary, like stepping out of one world and back into another. And she exhaled, adjusting the strap of her bag as she made her way toward the exit, telling herself it was just another job, just another client. Even if nothing about it had felt normal. That night, in her small apartment, The hum of the old refrigerator and the flicker of a dim overhead light replaced the quiet perfection of the penthouse, and Emily sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the folded notice on the table, the red letters still as unforgiving. As before, 3 days had become 2, and the weight of it pressed heavier now that she had seen how easily things could be different, how close she had been to solving everything with one wrong decision. She shook the thought away, pushing herself up to check her phone, scrolling through missed calls and job listings, none of them promising, none of them enough, until a new message appeared, simple, direct, from an unknown number, same time tomorrow. It read, nothing more, and for a moment, she just stared at it, her brow furrowing slightly, because she had not been told she was needed again. No instructions, no confirmation, just that one line, and somehow she knew exactly who it was from. The next morning, she stood in front of the building again, the early sunlight reflecting off the glass, her reflection faintly visible, worn sneakers, simple clothes, nothing about her changed, and yet something inside her felt different, steadier, as if the decision she had made the day before had anchored her in a way she had not expected. She entered without hesitation this time. The routine already familiar, the elevator ride still quiet but no longer uncertain. And when the doors opened to the top floor, the same stillness greeted her, the same quiet presence waiting somewhere inside. She stepped into the penthouse, setting her supplies down in the same place as before, her movements more confident now, less cautious, though she still felt that awareness, that sense of being observed. As she began to work, she noticed something almost immediately. Small but intentional. The envelope was gone from the table, replaced instead by something else, a neatly folded stack of cash sitting in plain view. Not hidden, not subtle, but obvious, impossible to ignore, and beside it, a single note with just 2 words written clearly, "For you." Emily paused, her hand hovering midair, her breath slowing as she read the words again, and something tightened in her chest. Not temptation this time, but something more complicated, because this was different. This was not forgotten money or an accident. This was an offer, a decision placed directly in front of her. She glanced toward the far end of the room, where he stood again, just as quiet, just as still, watching without saying a word, and for a moment, the entire space seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what she would do, and Emily realized that whatever this was, whatever he was doing, it was not over, not even close. And this next choice might matter even more than the last. Emily did not move for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the small note resting beside the stack of cash, the words "For you" sitting heavier than anything she had seen the day before, because this was no longer a question of temptation. It was a direct offer, clear, intentional, and impossible to misunderstand. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth in her hand as she let out a slow breath, her mind racing through everything she needed, everything she was about to lose, the rent, the food, the fragile line she was trying to hold together. And for a brief second, the simplest answer felt dangerously close. Just take it. No one would blame you. It was given, not taken. But something deeper held her in place, something quieter but stronger, the same instinct that had pulled her hand back the day before, and she finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes across the room. He had not moved, not stepped closer, not said a word, just watching, waiting, as if this moment mattered more than anything else. Emily walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, until she reached the table, the cash still untouched, the note still waiting, and she picked it up carefully, reading it once more before setting it back down exactly where it had been. Her movements calm, controlled, leaving no sign of hesitation. Then, without looking at the money again, she turned and continued cleaning, as if nothing had changed. The silence behind her shifted, not broken, but altered, like something had just tipped in a direction that could not be undone. And after a few seconds, his voice came, quieter than before, but carrying something new beneath it. "It was meant for you," he said, not pressing, just stating it plainly, and Emily paused, her back still to him, considering her words carefully before answering. "I am already being paid to do a job," she said, her voice steady. "That is enough." And there was a faint pause, longer than expected, before he spoke again. Most people would not say that, and this time she allowed herself a small breath, almost a smile, though he could not see it. Most people are not about to lose everything, she replied honestly, and then she turned slightly, just enough for him to hear the truth in her tone. Which is exactly why it has to matter, she added. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different, heavier with meaning, as if something unspoken had just been confirmed. And for the first time since she had stepped into that penthouse, the space between them no longer felt like distance, but like something slowly being built, piece by piece. She returned to her work, her movements steady, her focus clear, and yet she could feel it now, not just his presence, but his attention changing, less like observation, more like consideration. Time passed, in that quiet rhythm, until eventually she finished the last room, setting her supplies down as she wiped her hands dry. And when she turned back toward the table, the cash was still there, untouched, exactly as she had left it, but the note was gone. Her eyes flicked toward him instinctively, and this time, he stepped forward just slightly, enough for the light to catch his expression more clearly, something thoughtful, something measured, and without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with a strange, unshakable feeling that whatever test this had been, she had just passed something far more important than she understood, and yet somehow, she knew it was not the last. The third day came faster than Emily expected, and this time, as she stood in front of the building, the weight in her chest felt different, heavier, sharper, because there was no more pretending she had time left. The notice on her door had not changed, the red letters still final, still unforgiving, and by tonight, if nothing changed, she would have nowhere to go. She closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying herself, then walked inside with the same quiet determination she had carried the day before, though now it felt less like choice and more like the last thing holding her together. The elevator ride was silent as always, but this time, her reflection in the mirrored walls caught her attention, tired eyes, shoulders slightly tense, someone who had been holding on for too long without saying it out loud. When the doors opened, the penthouse greeted her with that same stillness, but something was different again, subtle but unmistakable. The air felt heavier, like something had shifted overnight. She stepped inside, setting her supplies down, her eyes instinctively scanning the room, and she noticed immediately that the table was clear now. No envelope, no cash, nothing left to test her in that way. And for a moment, she did not know if she felt relief or disappointment. She began to clean, her movements automatic, practiced, but her mind kept drifting, not to the money, but to him, to the way he had watched, the way he had spoken, the questions he had asked that no one ever asked her, and she could not explain why, but it had stayed with her longer than it should have. She was wiping down the kitchen counter when she heard footsteps behind her, more deliberate this time, not hidden, not distant, and when she turned, he was closer than before, standing in full light for the first time, his presence no longer just a shadow in the corner. There was something different in his expression, less guarded, more direct, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching but no longer uncomfortable. Then he said something she did not expect. "You do not have to come back tomorrow," his voice calm, almost neutral, but the words landed heavier than they should have, and Emily felt her chest tighten slightly, not because she had expected anything, but because she had not realized how much this had begun to matter. She nodded slowly, processing it. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady though. Something inside her shifted, like a door quietly closing. She turned back to her work, finishing what she had started, but the rhythm felt different now, less certain, like she was moving toward an ending she had not prepared for. After a few minutes, he spoke again, his tone quieter this time. "What will you do?" he asked, and the question caught her off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was real, more real than anything else that had happened here. She paused, her hands resting lightly on the counter, and for a moment, she did not answer, because the truth was not something she usually said out loud. "I will figure it out," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, not hopeful, not defeated, just honest. There was a long silence after that, the kind that seemed to stretch further than the room itself, and when she turned slightly, she saw him watching her again, but this time, there was no distance in it, no test, just something quieter, something almost conflicted. She finished cleaning shortly after, gathering her things with the same care as always. And when she walked toward the door, she hesitated for just a second, not turning, not speaking, just standing there as if something unspoken was still waiting in the space behind her. But then she stepped forward, opening the door, unaware that the moment she was about to leave would change everything she thought she understood about him. Her hand was already on the door handle when his voice stopped her again, quieter than before, but carrying a weight that made her pause without thinking. "Emily," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, the sound of it unfamiliar in his voice, steady but no longer distant. She turned slowly, her brows drawing together slightly, not in fear, not in expectation. Just curiosity, because something about the way he said it felt different, like this was no longer part of whatever silent game he had been playing. He took a step closer into the light, his expression more open than she had ever seen it, though still controlled, still careful, as if every word mattered more than it should. "You said you would figure it out," he continued, his tone even, but there was something beneath it, something almost hesitant, and Emily nodded faintly, her fingers loosening from the door handle as she faced him fully now. "I will," she answered, because there was nothing else to say, nothing else she had left. There was a pause, longer this time, and she could see it, the shift in him, like he was deciding something in real time, weighing it against everything he had already observed, everything he had already tested. And then he said something she did not expect at all. "What if I told you that you do not have to?" And the words hung in the air between them, quiet but impossible to ignore. Emily's expression tightened slightly, not defensive, but cautious now, because she had learned enough in the past few days to know that nothing he said was simple, nothing was without purpose, and she shook her head gently. "I am not looking for a handout," she replied, her voice calm but firm, drawing a line without raising it. He held her gaze, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledging it, as if this response was exactly what he had anticipated. And for a second, something almost like approval flickered in his eyes again. "I know," he said quietly, and this time there was no test in it, no hidden edge, just certainty. "That is why this matters," he added, and Emily felt her breath catch slightly, because she did not understand what he meant, not fully, but she could feel that whatever this was, it had moved beyond the boundaries she had set in her own mind. "You fixed something that most people would have replaced," he continued, his voice steady, referring to the cracked frame without naming it. "You walked away from money you needed, twice, and you did it without asking for anything in return." And Emily looked at him, her confusion now mixed with something deeper, something more uncertain, because she had not done those things for him. She had done them because she could not do anything else and still recognize herself. "That is not common," he said, softer now, almost to himself, and then his gaze returned to hers, more direct than ever before. "And it is not something I ignore." And for the first time, the space between them felt charged, not with tension, but with something shifting into place. Emily swallowed, her mind trying to catch up, trying to understand what he was offering without offering it outright, and she shook her head slightly. "I just did my job," she said, because that was the truth she could hold on to, the only one that made sense. He studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something final, something he had been building toward from the moment she stepped off that elevator. And then he said, "Tomorrow morning, be here at 8, his tone returning to something more neutral, but the weight of it still there, still undeniable. "If you want to see what comes next," he added, not as a command, not as a promise, but as a choice placed back in her hands. Emily stood there, caught between everything she knew and everything she did not, her heart beating just a little faster as she realized that walking away now would be easier, safer, but staying might change everything. And for the first time since this all began, she did not feel like she was being tested. She felt like she was being invited into something she did not yet understand. Emily did not sleep much that night, the quiet of her small apartment pressing in around her as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over in her mind, not as a promise, not even as an offer, but as something more unsettling, a possibility she could not fully define. "Be here at 8, he had said, "if you want to see what comes next," and the more she thought about it, the less it felt like a simple choice. because walking away would mean returning to the version of her life she already understood, the overdue rent, the uncertainty, the constant calculation of what she could afford to lose, while going back meant stepping into something unknown, something that had already begun to change. The way she saw things. By morning, the sky was still pale with early light when she stood outside the building again, her breath steady but her thoughts anything but, and for a brief second, she hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, because this was the moment where she could still turn around, still choose the familiar struggle over whatever this was. But then she exhaled and stepped forward, pushing through the doors without looking back. The lobby was quiet at that hour, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. And as she crossed toward the elevator, she noticed something she had not before, the way the staff greeted her differently now, subtle but there, a nod, a glance that lingered just a second longer, as if her presence had already been noted, already been placed somewhere she did not yet understand. The elevator ride felt shorter this time, the numbers climbing quickly, and when the doors opened, the top floor was no longer silent. Voices echoed faintly from down the hall, low and controlled, the kind of voices that carried authority without needing to raise their volume. And Emily slowed her steps instinctively, her heart picking up as she moved toward the open space ahead. The penthouse looked different now, no longer dim and still, but alive with movement. A small group of sharply dressed people standing near the far end of the room, tablets in hand, speaking in clipped, precise tones as they reviewed something she could not see. She stopped just inside the doorway, unsure for the first time since she had started coming here, her presence suddenly out of place in a way it had not been before, and then she saw him. He stood at the center of it all, no longer in shadow, no longer silent, his posture straight, his voice calm but commanding as he spoke to the people around him, each word measured, each instruction followed without question. Emily felt something shift in her chest, not shock. Exactly, but recognition, like pieces of something she had not been trying to solve suddenly clicking into place. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room until it found her, and for a brief second, the conversation around him seemed to pause, not fully, but enough that the space between them felt clear, undeniable. There was no hesitation in his expression now, no distance, just certainty. And as he stepped forward, leaving the others behind, Emily realized with a quiet, undeniable clarity that whatever she had thought this was before, she had only been seeing a fraction of it, and that the man who had been watching her in silence was not just observing anymore. He was revealing something far bigger than she had been prepared to understand. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she had spoken to in quiet, shadowed rooms with the one now standing in front of a team that clearly answered to him without question. And as he approached her, the shift in him was impossible to ignore, not just in how he carried himself, but in how the entire room seemed to move around him, adjusting, waiting, responding. He stopped a few feet away, close enough now that there was no distance left to hide behind, and, for the first time, his voice carried the full weight of who he was, calm, controlled, but undeniably authoritative. "You came back," he said, not surprised, but certain, and Emily nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face as if she could still find the version of him she thought she knew somewhere beneath this one. "You asked me to," she replied, her voice steady, though there was a quiet tension beneath it now. Behind him, the group remained where they were, watching without openly staring, their presence a silent confirmation that this moment mattered beyond just the two of them. He glanced briefly in their direction, then back to her, as if deciding something in real time, and then he said, "Walk with me." Not as a command, but not quite a request either, and without waiting for her answer, he turned and began moving toward the far side of the penthouse. Emily hesitated for only a second before following, her steps measured, her thoughts racing, because whatever this was, it was no longer something she could define as simple or contained. They moved through a hallway she had not entered before, quieter, more private, until they reached a glass-walled office overlooking the city, the morning light spilling across the room in sharp, clean lines, and he stopped there, turning to face her fully. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling in a way that felt different from before, not filled with observation, but with something more direct, more final. "You have been wondering what this is," he said, his tone even, and Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh without humor. "I stopped trying to guess," she admitted, "because it was the truth, and there was no point pretending otherwise." He studied her for a second, then gave a slight nod, as if that answer confirmed something he already believed, and then he said the words that shifted. "Everything. I own this building." And the simplicity of it made it land harder, not because she did not already suspect it, but because hearing it out loud erased any space for doubt. Emily's expression did not change much, but something in her posture did, a subtle tightening, a quiet recalibration of everything she had experienced over the past few days, and she nodded once, absorbing it. "I figured," she said softly, though the weight of it was still settling in. He held her gaze, not pushing, not explaining further, just letting the truth exist between them. And then he continued, "Everything you saw, everything that happened, was intentional." And this time, Emily's eyes shifted, not in shock, but in understanding, the pieces aligning in a way that felt both clarifying and unsettling. She exhaled slowly, her voice calm but more guarded now. "So it was a test," she said, not accusing, just naming it for what it was, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his expression that was harder to define, not denial, not exactly agreement, something in between. "Yes," he said after a brief pause, his voice quieter now, but still steady, "but not in the way you think." And Emily felt that same tension return, sharper this time, because whatever came next would define everything that had already happened, and whether any of it had been real at all. Emily held his gaze, the words settling between them heavier than anything he had said before, because now there was no ambiguity left, no space to pretend this had been coincidence or chance. And for a moment, she said nothing, her mind moving through every interaction, every silence, every choice she had made, seeing them now through a different lens. "Then how was it?" she asked finally, her voice calm but edged with something firmer. Now, not anger, but clarity. And Daniel did not look away, did not soften the truth. "It was not about whether you would take the money," he said, his tone steady. "It was about who you are when no one is telling you what the right choice is." And Emily felt something tighten in her chest at that, not because she disagreed, but because it meant everything she had done had been seen, measured in ways she had not consented to. She crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, but grounding herself. "You could have just asked," she replied, and there was a quiet honesty in it that made the space between them feel smaller, more real, and for the first time, Daniel's expression shifted in a way she had not seen before, something less controlled, more human. "People tell you what you want to hear when you ask," he said, and there was a weight in that sentence that hinted at something deeper, something learned over time. "They show you who they are when they think no one is watching," he added. Softer now, and Emily looked at him differently then, not as the man who had tested her, but as someone who had expected to be disappointed. She exhaled slowly, her posture easing just slightly, though the line between them still held. "And what happens now?" she asked, because that was the part that mattered, not the test, not the reasoning, but what came after. Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering, as if this was the part he had been building toward all along, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of certainty, not observational, but intentional. "Now I make you an offer," he said, and Emily felt her focus sharpen instantly, her attention narrowing to the words that followed. "Not money," he added, almost immediately, as if anticipating her resistance. "Not charity." And there was something in his tone that made it clear he understood exactly where her boundaries were. He stepped slightly closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough to make it clear this mattered. "You said you wanted something of your own," he continued, referencing her words from before with precise clarity. "A business, something steady, something honest." And Emily's breath caught slightly, not because of the idea, but because he had remembered, because he had listened, in a way she had not expected. "I am offering you the chance to build that," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Not for me, not under me, but with the support you would need to actually make it real." And the words hung there, heavy with possibility, but also with risk, because this was no longer about passing a test. This was about stepping into something she had only imagined from a distance. Emily looked at him, her thoughts racing, her instincts pulling in different directions, because part of her wanted to walk away, to reject the entire situation as something she had not asked for. But another part, quieter but undeniable, recognized the weight of what he was offering, not as a handout, but as a door she had never been able to reach before. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice softer now, not doubtful, but searching for something deeper than opportunity, and Daniel held her gaze without hesitation. His answer simple, but carrying more truth than anything else he had said. "Because you already proved you would not take the easy way out," he said, and for the first time, Emily felt the full impact of everything that had happened, not as a test she had endured, but as a path she had unknowingly walked toward this exact moment. Emily did not answer right away, his words still echoing in her mind, not because she did not understand them, but because she did, and that was exactly what made this moment so difficult. She looked away briefly, her gaze drifting toward the glass wall where the city stretched endlessly below, people moving through their lives, making choices that seemed simple from a distance, but never felt that way when you were standing inside them. "You are offering me something I have wanted for a long time," she said finally, her voice steady but quieter now, more reflective, and Daniel did not interrupt, did not push, just waited, as if he understood that whatever she said next mattered more than anything he could add. She turned back to him slowly, her expression composed but thoughtful. "But you are also the one who decided I was worth testing," she continued, not accusing, not harsh, just stating the truth as she saw it. And for a brief second, something in his expression tightened, not defensively, but as if he recognized the weight of that distinction. "You watched me struggle," she added, her voice still calm. "You knew I needed that money." And she paused, letting that reality sit between them, not as blame, but as context. "And you chose not to help," she finished, her words quiet but clear. The room fell silent, not uncomfortable, but heavy with honesty, and Daniel did not look away, did not deny it, because there was nothing to deny, only something to understand. "If I had stepped in then," he said after a moment, his voice measured, "you would not be standing here now." And Emily considered that, her mind weighing the truth of it, because part of her knew he was right, but another part still felt the distance between intention and impact. She took a slow breath, grounding herself, because this was no longer about whether she could accept what he was offering. It was about whether she could accept how it had come to her. "I do not want something built on being tested," she said. Finally, her voice firm now, not rejecting the opportunity, but defining her terms. "I want something that is mine because I earned it, not because I passed something I did not agree to." And Daniel listened, truly listened, his posture still, his attention focused entirely on her. And for the first time, there was no calculation in his expression, no evaluation, just consideration. He stepped back slightly, not retreating, but giving her space, acknowledging the line she had drawn, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, less controlled, more open. "Then do not take it as an offer," he said, his voice steady but different now. "Take it as a starting point." And Emily frowned slightly, not confused, but trying to understand the difference he was asking her to see. "You build it," he continued. "You make every decision, every choice, every mistake." And there was a quiet intensity in his words now, not persuasive, but sincere. "The only thing I provide is what you do not have. Yet, the resources, the space, the time." And he paused, letting that settle. "Everything else is yours to earn," he finished. Emily held his gaze, her thoughts moving through his words, testing them the way he had tested her, searching for anything that felt conditional, anything that felt like it came with a hidden cost. But there was nothing obvious, nothing immediate, just the weight of possibility and the risk that came with it. "And if I say no?" she asked quietly, because she needed to know that part too, needed to understand where her choice truly stood, and Daniel did not hesitate. "Then nothing changes," he said simply. "You walk out that door, and your life continues exactly as it would have." And there was no threat in it, no pressure, just truth. Emily nodded slowly, absorbing that. Because for the first time since this had begun, the decision felt entirely hers, not shaped by a test, not influenced by expectation, just a choice standing in front of her, waiting to be made. And as she stood there in the quiet of that room, she realized that whatever she chose next would not just change her situation, it would define who she was willing to become. Emily stood there in the quiet of the glass-walled office, the city stretching endlessly behind her. But for the first time in a long time, her focus was not on what she might lose, it was on what she could choose. She took a slow breath, letting the weight of everything settle. The past few days, the tests, the silence, the unexpected offer, and then she looked at Daniel, not as a billionaire, not as someone who had controlled the situation, but as a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows and placed the decision entirely in her hands. "If I do this," she said, her voice calm but firm, "it will not be because you offered it." And he did not interrupt, did not correct her, just listened. "It will be because I decide to build something, and I decide how it is built," she continued, drawing the line clearly, not rejecting him, but defining the terms she could live with. Daniel nodded once, slowly, a quiet acknowledgement that carried more respect than any promise, and in that moment, something shifted between them again, not a test, not a transaction, but a mutual understanding. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod of her own, not dramatic, not emotional, just certain. "Then I will come back tomorrow," she said, and the words felt different this time, not uncertain, not reactive, but chosen. The tension in the room eased, in a way that was almost imperceptible, but real, and Daniel stepped aside slightly, not leading, not directing, just allowing the moment to move forward on her terms. Later that day, as Emily stepped out of the building, the sunlight hit her differently, not because anything around her had changed, but because something inside her had. The weight of uncertainty was still there, the challenges had not disappeared, but now there was something else alongside it, something steadier, something she had not felt in a long time: direction. That night, she returned to her small apartment, the same flickering light, the same quiet space, but when she looked at the notice on the table, it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a line she was about to cross. The next morning, when she walked back into the building at exactly 8 o'clock, she was no longer the girl who had stepped into the wrong place by accident. She was someone who had been given a choice and had decided to take it on her own terms. Upstairs, the penthouse was already alive again. But this time, when she entered, she did not hesitate, and as Daniel turned to face her, there was no distance left